Hey everybody, Judy here. I know the last few days have been a lot of information and kind of tough to look at. I wanted to show basically my understanding of intergenerational trauma and kind of why I came up with the concept of or what tossed around in my head to spit out the concept of a colonized unconscious and decolonizing the unconscious. And so I want to take a look a little bit at intergenerational trauma. And I'm going to screen share for this so you can follow through. Now, my understanding is just very, very basic. And what I'm going to tell you or share with you is very, very basic. So if feel free to comment, look at other resources, talk to people. That's how I got this concept, was talking to a lot of First Nations people over the course of 15 years. Chiefs, counselors, spiritual people, men, women, youth, politicians, professionals, a broad spectrum of First Nations people, and all across Canada as well. I've been very fortunate to be able to talk with people all across Canada about what's happening for them and where they feel they've come from. And yeah, it's been quite the journey. So I'm going to start screen share and explain, give you why I feel this is important. I try hard not to speak for other people, but this is what struck me about intergenerational trauma and the way that it's fallen on down, not fallen on down, come down the chain from generation to generation. Okay, so here we go. And screen share first. There we go. Okay, intergenerational trauma. 1876. So that isn't that long ago in our society, in our world's history. That's minutes, seconds in our world's history. But if you compare it to, say, grade 12, okay, grade 12 being you graduate, you've learned what you need to learn to move out into the world. 12 years, this would be approximately contact at, say, 400 years. That's a fifth. That's 2.5 years of school. And being up at a grade 12 level. So I have incredible amount of admiration for First Nations people and their ability to negotiate a foreign system while keeping their cultures, their language, their practices intact for the most part. I mean, there is some that's been lost, but an immense amount of respect and kudos. So when First Nations were forced onto reserves, remembering that First Nations had a what's it called? They would travel around for food. Various areas were for various things. Fishing camps, moose calving grounds, where you didn't hunt in moose calving grounds, but other areas, and various things like this, where the herds would come through of maybe the buffalo or elk or caribou, where these would come through, deer as well, where berries were picked, where certain berries were, medicines, etc. So the land had broad uses and wasn't necessarily used all the time. But when First Nations were forced onto reserves, now all of a sudden that changes. And how did they get food now? Well, at that time, Indian agent. So you had there was an Indian agent that would give you, or give the people, flour, sugar, butter, I believe, maybe milk, trying to encourage a farming lifestyle or whatever. Yeah. But what happened was the diet changed, the lifestyle changed. So the diet now moved towards more mainstream settler diet. What we have found currently is that First Nations are much healthier when they have wild meat, their traditional diet in their meal spectrum. Lifestyle. First Nations were very active. They hunted, they trapped. All of these things very active, very physical. And now they're being given food and staying on a particular piece of land. So we can see that contributes on down the line to less and less traditional food being eaten, therefore disease, unhealthy things coming up in their life, such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease, all these things that were not there. Okay. At the same time, traditional governance systems were outlawed. They had to conform to First Nations had to conform to a similar governance structure to mayor and council. So actually, there wasn't even chief and council; it was a band council. Governance changes. Now, imagine that, or imagine what happened was the grandmothers of the community would watch the young children, and they would see which ones would be suited for which roles in the community, and they were the ones to pick chief. And this child or these children were raised for that role, for that responsibility, for responsibility for the people, for the community, for negotiations or such with other communities, for stewardship of the land. Okay? Along with that governance structure that got dropped, so did the women's voice in community. Matriarchies were no longer matriarchies. We got introduced to patriarchy. Hello there. Yeah, which definitely didn't help. And of course, gender roles. Gender roles became very strict. There wasn't the fluidity. There wasn't recognition of the two-spirited as there had been previously. So then we drop down to when children were forced into residential schools. Now, this one blows me away. 1996, my youngest was 6 years old at that time. He would have been taken from me to go to residential school at 6 years old. My baby. I can't imagine. I can't imagine how the parents would have felt. And those parents were told, give me your children or you will go to jail. Imagine a dad having to give up his child because he'd go to jail if he didn't. That's even if you speak the language, even if this was fear. This was done with fear. So fear and control by the RCMP. So we can kind of see where the fear and the angst against the RCMP comes in. The violence, the abuse, the dysfunction that was done onto these children, the starvation policies, the experiments done on them at these residential schools, not to mention the sexual abuse and the physical abuse, the deaths, the children who died trying to escape, all of those things, as well as the family. When those kids came back, they were totally disconnected, or I shouldn't say totally, but they were disconnected from their family because they'd lost their language, or many of them had lost their language. They remembered very little. They were beaten if they used it. The mothers had sent away these beautiful, beautiful children to learn trades, to become educated, to succeed better in this world. And what they were sent back were these children who had been abused horrifically in a lot of cases. And this very much destroyed some of the mothers, some of the fathers. Think about that. Think about the trauma that would have arisen around that if it were your child. And so there's that level right there. So we have violence entering into it. We have dysfunction. We have family. We also have alcoholism and drugs entering in at that point. No one wants to remember abuse. No one wants to remember that pain. So why would you not turn to something mood altering? Okay, and then we drop down to when the children were stolen. 1960s was the 60s scoop. And there is documentation now that some of those kids were adopted out of Canada and into the States and had been paid for. You know, I want a baby. I'm childless. I want a baby. Here's money. Give me a baby. And so these children are taken and given to that's child trafficking. And that was going on then. Whether or not the social workers knew that was what was happening, I don't know. But there is evidence for it. And what happened there? One woman I spoke to from Saskatoon, she described being apprehended or taken from her family at 11 years old. Now, psychology teaches us that around 8, a person's belief system, identity, etc., is established. So 3 years after, this young woman is taken to New Jersey and expected to fit in there. When I spoke to her, she was living on the streets and still very, very confused as to her identity and where she belonged. She was back in her community, but it didn't feel right. Yeah. So these are some of the areas that when you see this, when you start looking at these various things, like the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-great-grandparents felt this, and their trauma went down to the great-grandparents, and their trauma went down to the grandparents, and their trauma went down to the parents, and their trauma was transmitted onto the kids. All these dysfunctions and maladaptive behaviors came right on down. Now, if we look at that from the perspective of the conscious and unconscious brain and all those I am messages, we can start to see how the unconscious mind has internalized trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma and got messages passed down as to how to react in these various situations and how to make sense of the world. So this is what I am talking about when I talk about decolonizing the unconscious and moving forward into a way of being in the world that has culture throughout throughout their life. Throughout their life. A gentleness, a peace, a confidence. And there are demonstrations of this throughout the First Nations community. My main concern, okay, we'll go with concern. My main concern or item here is the youth committing suicide. This is where I go to with the intergenerational trauma. So, if you have comments, if you have questions, if you don't like, if you want, share the video. Get more comments, get more feedback. It can only make things better and open discussions. This would be wonderful. Let's start having discussions. If you feel I've offended you, comment. I'd like to hear that feedback as well. If you don't want to comment publicly, please send me a Facebook message. Hugs and love, everybody. Yeah. Have a wonderful day. And we'll talk soon. And that stops the share. There we are. Hugs and love. Have a beautiful day.